Hello everyone and welcome into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all yet again for tuning in. Happy Monday to you all. Hope you enjoyed your weekend. Hope you enjoyed the weekend slate of football in both NFL and college football action. We have a lot to talk about today, starting off by previewing tonight's games, a doubleheader in the NFL, a flexed game, Ravens-Bucks and Chargers-Cardinals, now at 9 o'clock. We're going to be going over the NFL and college football fantasy stars of the week, as we always do. We're going to be talking about my bold fantasy predictions, my Don't Be Surprised If segment. And then, to close out the show, we're going to be doing my first, of course, my many positional rankings this week, by looking at the quarterback position. Before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you, yet again, that if you want to view more content like this or other podcasts as well, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show on the network. But if you want to interact with the show more directly today, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. They're a great way to contribute. You can tip or donate through clicking the $ on the comment section there, or you just leave a burning question, comment, or concern you have throughout the show. Just makes it that much more better, that much more interactive, and just allows me to hear other people's opinions as well. Without further ado, let's jump right into today's first segment, talking about those Monday Night Football games. Let's start off by talking about the first one, perhaps the more exciting of the two, one that I'm definitely looking forward to seeing. A lot of fantasy stakes for me in that game as well. Ravens-Bucks. Let's talk about this very interesting yet bizarre intra-conference matchup. Baltimore is favored by 3.5 at home. The over-under is 49.5. Tampa Bay plus 160 to win. Baltimore at minus 190. And of course, this is the more exciting of the two games, so I'm glad that it got flexed there. Maybe a couple questions from certain fans about whether or not this was the correct game to flex to this Monday night primetime slot, but I do feel that it holds merit. This is a game between two very exciting offenses with two very different styles, one in which Lamar Jackson is this very dynamic player that predicates his offense on RPOs, quick throws, and things of that nature. And then you look at the Bucks, where they're building a culture there with a lot of swagger. Baker proven to be a great motivator and leader for this team. And also, the chemistry between him and his receivers is an all-time high. But on the defensive end is where I want to look, because both of these defenses project to be, at the very least, top 15, top 10 units. Maybe not as much as the Bucks, but I certainly think highly of the Ravens defense. That is where this game is going to be won and lost. Which of these defenses can step up? Because we know that both of them have big-time players, but they haven't really proved that they are more than the sum of their parts. Obviously, you know, the loss of Mike McDonald at the defensive coordinator position is huge for this Baltimore Ravens defense, and it's shown through the first couple of weeks of the season, but they have steadily improved as the season goes on to play complementary football. On the Bucs side of things, they just haven't had a full bill of health on that side of the football. You look at guys like Vita Vea, Kalijah Kancey going down, Antoine Winfield also going down for a couple of weeks. So, as you can see, vital pieces for both of these defenses either haven't been playing up to par or haven't stepped on the football field in quite some time. So, while the big story definitely is both these offenses and how they look and how they play, and whether or not this game will turn into a shootout, I'm looking at which defense makes more plays for their team. Because, not for nothing, the Ravens, if they win this game, feel like they can be the team to beat in the AFC. The Bucs, on the other hand, are looking for more respect than they're getting. This is perhaps their toughest game to date. They've already lost the Falcons. They will play the Falcons next week in their second of two matchups thus far. And so if they win this game, they are setting themselves up for success in the NFC South and proving that they could have a say in the NFC playoff race. Now, it's going to be very tough to beat this team, and that is why, when all is said and done, I will take the Ravens in this one if I were a bettor. But I do think that the Bucs will keep this as close as possible. They're not going to get lost in this narrative of not being able to beat superior teams, because they are right there. Last year they fell to the Lions in a heartbreaking game. But this year, I just feel like they're putting all the pieces together and they're well built to make games out of what previously could have been games where you would see them trip up beforehand. And so this feels like a game that I still would take the Ravens in, but I do think the Bucs will have a say in how it goes. And then we have to talk about this game, but to be honest with you, I don't know if I want to stay up till the wee hours of the morning to watch this one. Chargers-Cardinals. And I think, for what it's worth, these are two teams that believe that they have an offensive identity, but we as fans cannot gauge whether or not they really are corporeal plans for these teams' improvements. On the Chargers side of things, I think that Jim Harbaugh is wanting to implement that run-first philosophy, make them more of a smash-mouth team, whereas with the Cardinals, they're heavily reliant on Kyler Murray being that guy who can improvise out of structure, get this team going, incorporate more receivers like MHJ. Maybe Trey McBride will have a say in this game, but ultimately just super reliant on Kyler Murray's abilities as a QB. And so it's going to be a very weird game here. That being said, I do think LA, which is the 2.5 point favorite, by the way, is the team that I feel like has adopted their new identity with fervor. And a lot of people might not like it because a lot of people loved what Justin Herbert was doing in the Brandon Staley era, even though they were not winning as much. But now he's not as prolific a passer as he once was. But that's just what I believe the situation is in LA as well. They saw that they were going to lose a lot of production. They lost Keenan Allen on the offensive side of the football. And now, with the hire of Jim Harbaugh, they're realizing that we can have a team that can dictate the game style, but not put that much pressure on Justin Herbert. And Herbert, not for nothing, is still a guy who I would trust with the game on the line. Let's say somehow the Cardinals' offense does turn it up a notch. I still think that Justin Herbert, when forced into action, is still a quarterback who can get the job done. It's not like he lost all the abilities he had in the Brandon Staley era. It's just that they are a run-heavier team now. And so I just feel like the LA Chargers, like I said, the 2.5 point favorite, also minus 135 to win, Arizona at plus 115. I do think just has more of an offensive identity, even when they run into issues along the way. They have the ability to grind out unpretty wins, ugly wins, so to speak. As Andre, my man, enters the chat. How are you doing, my friend? Hope you had a great weekend. At the end of the day, both of these games do have intriguing storylines, but I just feel like the Ravens-Bucs is the one I'm going to have my full attention on. Not for nothing, what I will be looking for in the Cardinals game is if the Cardinals can have more sustained drives where they control the football more. Because it is very much a pressure cooker environment for Kyler Murray there to elevate this offense. And MHJ was cleared to play, but he may not look like the sum of his parts in this one as he is recovering from that concussion. So look for a little bit more control I want to see out of the Arizona Cardinals. Whereas the Chargers, I just feel like will continue to play their brand of football. I just think that as long as Dobbins is strong, that O-line holds up, and Justin Herbert is timely and efficient whenever he's asked to throw the football, the Chargers have a game plan. As Andre said, that was a bad concussion too. A lot of bad concussions throughout the NFL season so far. We're going to talk a little bit later in the week about all the injuries, but man, all of these, especially young receivers, getting concussed, that's one thing that you have to watch out for, especially when you're a team like the Arizona Cardinals or the New York Giants for that matter, who rely so much on these young players. So it's something to monitor. That's something to monitor for the Arizona Cardinals going forward, because he's a big part of what they need going forward in order to elevate their offensive game plan. At the end of the day, as Andre said, what happened to the question that I did not want to be asked today. We'll talk a little bit about this in college football, but to be honest with you, this may sound like a lame excuse, but something that people won't necessarily talk about in this game is the field position battle. Georgia, all due respect to their defense, which played an incredible game. I'll give them that. But you have to wonder, if Texas gets at least one possession in that first half that takes place anywhere outside of their own 25 to 10 yard line, maybe those turnovers that Quinn Ewers had early in the game will not live up to much. Maybe there'll be more field goals kicked for Georgia. Yes, as Andre said, the defense looked great, but the offense just wasn't there, sadly. And I completely agree with that statement. The defense was fine. It's just a matter of the offense either A, being backed up, or B, just getting overwhelmed. And I think that's the factor. As Andre said, there's much more upside for Texas in a rematch. I think you guys win. We did get the game plan to win that game. So I do believe we do have a chance if there is an SEC championship game rematch, but it's all going to come down to winning the field position battle, because that was the story of the game for me. I was just thinking, man, if we just had one possession, either with our backs close, not too close to the end zone, I think we have a chance to win this game, or make it closer than it appeared in the end. So that's just my takeaway from it. Thank you for that comment. We're going to talk a little bit about college football later in the show, where we have to take a quick break. And when we come back, I'll be talking first about my NFL Fantasy Stars of the Week, and then, of course, my college football Fantasy Fans of the Week. And we'll be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Before we get to our second segment, I do want to remind you guys that, again, if you want to interact with the show more directly, continue to make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to contribute to the show. Speaking of which, we come back from the break to two comments concerning still the topic of Texas here, the Texas QB situation. One from SJ, one from Andre. SJ asking the simple question whether or not I believe Arch Manning or Quinn Ewers is the guy going forward for the Texas Longhorns. And I still believe that Ewers is the right option, but I do think what concerns me about Ewers is that in moments where he does get injured, I do feel like he's one of those QBs going forward, especially in his NFL career, you're going to have to worry about in terms of timeline to return. I actually believe that potentially he could have set out the Oklahoma game, maybe come back, but that would have been asking him a little bit too much. But I still think that he's the right guy for the job because, as we saw, Arch is like a nice project right now. Just getting him out on the field for 2.5 games, 2.25 games was a nice thing to have. But I just don't think that for this tough SEC run, he will be prepared for the rigors of that. Quinn, not for nothing, yes, he's not looked good since his return, but Quinn just has that experience, and I just feel like as the season progresses, he'll find his way back, as Andre, though, does say he doesn't look like himself, and that is a concern. But I still give him the edge over Arch just because Arch hasn't seen anything approaching an SEC defense, because not for nothing, Georgia has a tough defense, but there will be tougher defenses as well. They still have Texas A&M at the end of the season. Arkansas and Kentucky are 2 tough games. Even Vanderbilt, if they can turn that into a shootout, it's a very tough game for them. But at the end of the day, I still think Quinn Ewers is the man. Just has that experience, knows what he's doing. When he has a full time to really process what's going on in the game, as we saw in that second half, did look a little bit better. But at the end of the day, I think the answer to the question is Quinn's the guy going forward. And he ultimately has the most upside if they get to a national championship game. But I do digress for a little bit. We do have to get back into our scheduled programming for today's show with our NFL Fantasy Stars of the Week. That is not the right graphic there. I do think I don't have a graphic, but we will go into this segment just talking about some of these stars of the week. Now, these 4 guys right here, maybe not the best at their positions, so to speak, but I do feel like they had very vital importance in terms of overall team play as well, because 4 or 3 out of these 4 teams that these players are on were in pretty precarious situations, and they needed strong performances from some of these guys. Some of these guys may be unexpected, but still needed performances from some of these guys to really get them back on track, especially the first guy that I want to talk about. And like I said, when I talk about my favorite teams on here, I'm not biased. I could have picked any of several quarterbacks. I could have picked the young Drake May, who showed a lot of moxie in that loss to Jacksonville abroad. I could have picked Jared Goff. Another almost perfect game, a perfect half, before only player in the NFL to date to have 2 perfect halves throwing the football. I could have picked any number of one, but completely unbiased. Perhaps the most impressive performance of the week in fantasy perspective, even though it wasn't necessarily the most pretty in terms of point production, was Geno Smith. 18 of 28, 207 yards, 2 touchdowns, 17.78. And not for nothing, I'm still shocked that at least in my league, Geno Smith is still on the waiver wire. He deserves and warrants some sort of start week in, week out for your fantasy squad, whether it be in a flex role in a deeper league. As Andre said, Stroud was right about May. The kid is phenomenal. Like, nothing on May here. But I do want to highlight guys who are the reason that their team won. May, for what it's worth, is in an incredibly dire situation and has looked really impressive regardless of that dire situation. But at the end of the day, I do think that fantasy value, as Andre said, I'm going to be honest, bro, I thought the Falcons were going to destroy you guys. Me too. I had a lot of trepidation going into this game because the Falcons were a hot offense. But Geno really stepped up to the plate. I'm shocked, like I said, that in some leagues he may still be on the waiver wire. This definitely was not his prettiest game, so to speak, as far as that is concerned, but it was his most efficient. He did not throw the football as much, but he made the most of it. He had some incredible throws, including that pass to end the half practically to DK Metcalf in that second half drive. But at the end of the day, what really impressed me about this performance from Geno from a fantasy perspective was I feel like what people aren't getting is that, yes, it's concerning for a quarterback, especially of Geno's age, especially behind that offensive line to throw the football that much, but he still is perhaps the most efficient quarterback with that sort of offensive line in the league. Not for nothing, that offensive line also performed pretty well. As Andre said, he's on waivers in mine, which is still shocking to me how he can be. So, Geno Smith, just wanted to give him his flowers. Could have picked anyone, really. But Geno Smith, an important game for his team, really efficient. Maybe not the prettiest performance of the season for him, but still one that was very sufficient. In terms of running backs, perhaps the best week by any position thus far this season from a fantasy perspective. The running backs really showed up. I could have picked like 5 running backs for my list this week. That was how good running backs performed. But the one running back that I wanted to highlight, in a situation where in his offense, his role has seemed lesser this season, but he really stepped up in a big way. Didn't know whether his backfield running mate was going to be healthy for this game, but he really stepped up for this game, and that is Jahmyr Gibbs. As honestly question, how do you feel about McDonald overall? Through these first 7 weeks, there's been some peaks, there's been some valleys. Obviously, the 3-0 start looked impressive. But like I said, it's against a rookie QB. Even this win against the Falcons was a little bit sketchy just because Kirk Cousins has those kinds of games. He's not the most mobile of quarterbacks, right? But I do really like what he's trying to do. And when he has a fully healthy defense, chances are we're going to see very Legion of Boom-esque stuff from them. Maybe that's getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I do think that the defense will take the right steps forward. And granted, in this game as well, they looked pretty good against a pretty solid offense overall. The run defense is still a bit of a concern, but for the most part, I'm really happy with the future of this season and beyond for what Mike McDonald could do for this defense. After that 3-game losing streak, to be honest with you, I didn't necessarily know where this team was headed. But granted, after 3 weeks, after 3 games in 11 days, with not much defensive depth to your name, you're still with a winning record right now. As Turgay Kaglar enters the chat, welcome my friend. Hey man, 49ers versus Cowboys or Chiefs versus Raiders or Lions versus Titans for week 8. Lions with 10 sacks, 8 interceptions, 3 fumble recoveries blinking at me. I believe you are asking about defensive help here. Very rarely we do get this question, but I love it. Out of all these defenses, I do believe the Chiefs' defense is the most pressing here, in my opinion. They're going up against the Raiders team that has lost a lot of luster with Devontae Adams leaving. And not for nothing, as Turgay also reminds me the Lions defense has 19 takeaways. So I do feel like the Chiefs have the easiest matchup here, but I do feel like you're right in saying that this is an opportunity for the Lions defense to prove that they're more than just Aiden Hutchinson. I really like how their secondary looked in that game against the Vikings. I really like what Brian Branch did. So there's a lot of talent there. But if you want my honest opinion, I do feel like the Chiefs have the easier matchup, and Steve Spagnuolo was such a defensive genius who I can't deny in these situations. Sometimes it's more about the defensive coordinator than the actual defense, and it might not make that much sense from a fantasy perspective, but that's what I ultimately feel. But thank you for your question. Getting back to my NFL fantasy stars here, talking about some surprising guys here. This guy certainly surprised me. Here's an interesting stat. Before yesterday, no Dolphins tight end had caught a touchdown since Week 12 of the 2022 season. That's a Mike Gesicki era for those of you watching. Until Jonnu Smith did it. 7 receptions, 96 yards, 1 touchdown, 22.6 fantasy points. Granted, this probably will not continue because of the fact there's so many questions about the Dolphins quarterback situation. Will Tua come back as early as next week? And if so, will he immediately get back to the deep balls to Hill and Waddle? But not for nothing. If you can get a tight end going, as Turgay says, thanks how many TD Dolphins have, TBH. Well, it honestly depends on whether or not Tua plays, as he also said they're awful, which at this point in the season is not that hard to see, but I still think there's a lot of upside whether or not Tua's playing there. They just don't necessarily, I guess, have the offensive nous or the coaching style to generate that on the field, but I still think they have a lot of upside. But going back to the point about Jonnu Smith, if they can get those tertiary, secondary players going, then you may have a chance to get back into it, because the AFC East is in shambles right now, and if you want to sneak into the postseason, you can if you play like a team that wants to distribute the wealth. But if that's all up to Mike McDaniel's play style. So in terms of touchdowns, I think they'll score with Tua about 3 or 4 without him. I don't even know if they score. Maybe 1 like they did this past weekend, but who knows. And the final one I want to cover here before we have to take a quick break is Brian Thomas. Really impressive performance abroad. His second game abroad. 5 receptions, 89 yards, 1 touchdown, 22.1. He's working up. And so when I look at this performance from Brian Thomas, I see a path forward where maybe the deep ball isn't as much of a concern for Jacksonville. Maybe it's just the benefits of being in London longer than the Patriots were, and thus being able to acclimate a little bit better. But if the Jags start going on a winning streak, which granted they could, they don't have the toughest of schedules coming up. I do think that at the end of the day, it's going to come down to the connection between Lawrence and Thomas here. So I do feel like these past performances from Brian Thomas are a sign that maybe the ineptitudes that we saw from the Jaguars offense, what with the deep ball, can be fixed or adjusted moving forward. Let me know what you think in the comments about my NFL fantasy start. But coming up next, if you're a college football fan, you want to stick around. We're going to be talking about our college football fantasy stars of the weekend right after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our third segment of the day here, I do want to address a comment left by Andre over the break. He's up 139 to 115 in his fantasy league. He has King Henry left to play, and he has Godwin. I think you got this one in the bag, my friend. Not for nothing, I do feel like both of these offenses will move the football effectively, but Godwin will have less targets, and Henry will just have more touches, just because he's so integral to how the Ravens play. So you have nothing to worry about. Huge blowout win for you, but in my fantasy perspective, this has to be a big Baker Mayfield game here. Very low scoring affair in my fantasy game, and it's all on the shoulders of my guy Baker Mayfield tonight. So hopefully he has a big game. But we do want to get into our third segment of the day here, transitioning a little bit, taking a little bit of a rest from the NFL for a bit, transitioning to the world of college football. We talked about the game that must not be named a little bit, and we will get into a little bit more college football talk later in the week. But we do want to go over some guys that may not have gotten a lot of respect in college football, as Andre also says. K9 with a monstrous performance for my team this week. I could have picked K9, the birthday boy, on Sunday. So, it was a very tough decision not to pick my guy, but I wanted to give Gino his props. Not for nothing, just because of how efficient he was in this game and what he might look like going forward. And at the end of the day, I love K9. I think he's perhaps the best weapon Seattle even has on that offense, because without him, you don't really get to the pass game all that much. And so, with his big performance, battling illness, coughing up his lungs post-game, what a gutsy performance from him, man. So, shout out to K9, but we do want to get into the college football world because we have a lot of interesting players who may be making their first time appearance on this list, repeat performer. So, without further ado, let's jump into them. Starting off with a little bit of a preview for the next segment. Sorry there. Justice Ellison of the Indiana Hoosiers, the running back. Now, a lot of people might not know the Indiana Hoosiers team, me included. I did not necessarily know this young man before that game against Nebraska, but phew, if Indiana becomes a little less Curtis Work-centric, which they might have to be, considering I do believe he's saying that injury in this game, may be out for a couple of weeks, they need to have secondary guys step up. We've had a couple of Indiana Hoosiers, as Anya said, he predicted Indiana to destroy them, and I agreed with you in that regard. But talking about Ellison, this is a team in Indiana with that win against Nebraska, who's clearly cemented themselves as Anya also says, not just a Big Ten contender, but a sneaky CFP team. So, if Curtis Work may have to sit out their QB for a couple of weeks, they're going to have secondary pieces step up. With 9 carries, 105 yards, 2 touchdowns, Justice Ellison did that in perhaps their biggest game to date this season. They still have games against Ohio State, and they still have a game, I believe, against Michigan. But Justice Ellison, look out for him as the running back here for the Indiana Hoosiers, 25.1 fantasy points, and just look out for any secondary weapons for them that may need to step up as the season goes along. They're a team of transfers. They built to the portal. Kurt Zignelli doing a great job. So all of these players need to play their role to the best of their abilities, and if so, who knows? We may be talking about Indiana in the early stages of January as a CFP contender. But another player I want to give their props, a guy who we've seen a lot on this list, Cam Ward. Cam Ward, at the end of the day, may just be the Heisman Trophy favorite. I know that a lot of people want those guys like Genty or Hunter to win, but the reality is you need to play for a high-level program. You need to be in high-pressure games and situations, and Cam Ward has proven that in those high-pressure situations, he rises to the occasion. He did it against Cal. He's now done it against Louisville. He did it against Virginia Tech, and he's just an incredible player. He makes it look so easy. 35 of 53, 437 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception, 32 fantasy points. And this guy, not for nothing, may just be holding up a shiny Heisman Trophy in New York at the end of the season. And maybe, just maybe, if Miami generates more pressure on defense, incorporates more weapons on offense outside of, the usual suspects with Ward and Restrepo and Martinez, then this team could win the CFP. I'm not joking. Their offense right now is just as good. It's just a question of the defense. Can they get that going? Because they don't want to be playing a lot of these shootouts, and suddenly, maybe in one game, Cam Ward slips up. So look out for that. But for now, Cam Ward is my Heisman favorite. But speaking of Heisman races, this is a guy, much like Genty, much like Hunter, who doesn't play for a high-profile program. But if I were a college football fan, I would want to see him in New York at the Heisman ceremony. Plays for a military service academy, an academy who themselves might be a sneaky CFP team come December and January. Let's talk a little bit about, we'll skip Sam Brown for now, Bryson Daly, because this performance is incredible. Now, like I said, there's going to be a lot of mountains to climb for Bryson Daly to get to New York. He needs to beat potentially Navy. Sorry about that noise, guys. I do feel like he needs to beat Navy at least twice to have a chance, and then Navy needs to be ranked and undefeated. But if he can do that, Army is undefeated, and they are seen as the highest-ranked Group of 5 conference champion. This kid needs to be in New York. Incredible triple option player. 7 for 10, 147 yards with 1 touchdown to the air. Obviously, in a triple option offense, you're not going to see much passing. But listen to his stats on the ground. 31 carries, 171 yards, and 5 touchdowns. 57 fantasy points. This kid is something to behold. And if Army continues with their meteoric rise, they continue being undefeated, chances are, not only will we see Bryson Daly in New York, we might see him contend for the Heisman, maybe even win it, and Army go into the CFP as the first military academy to make it. Let's get back to Miami as well, because they have another college football fantasy star of the week on my list, and that is Samuel Brown. And this one is a bit of an important one because, like I mentioned, the Miami offense is a very potent offense, but it has 3 players that it relies upon a bit too heavily in Restrepo, Ward, and Martinez. Sam Brown, though, in this game really stepped up. The Houston transfer came into this team, potentially making it one of the deepest wide receiver cores in college football. We haven't really seen much of it, really. We've only really heard Restrepo's name in Miami circles thus far this season as the wide receiver 1. We haven't really seen, anyone outside of that trifecta really step up. But Samuel Brown did today. 3 receptions, 125 yards, 1 TD in that game against Louisville, 20 fantasy points. And if this continues, Miami, for as long as they'll be in shootout type games, they'll still look appealing offensively and they'll still be dangerous because their game plan is that they can beat any team through their offensive weapons. And so if there are more than just the 3 and less pressure falls on their shoulders, then Miami's offense can consistently put up, say, as many points as they did against Louisville. So Samuel Brown's performance is a very important one to note. Maybe not the best out of wide receivers this week, but I do feel like if this continues, if he's a solid wide receiver 2 for Miami as the season goes on, this is a team that can put up a lot of points and force teams to play catch up with them. Thus far, they've gotten into a couple close calls, but if Samuel Brown emerges, those close calls can turn into blowouts in a hurry. So that's why I really wanted to mention his performance above all receivers because of how integral he could be for Miami's CFP aspirations. But overall, in the world of college football, I could have picked a number of players. I could have picked the Georgia defense if defense was a big deal in fantasy college football. Incredible performance by them. I feel like Trevor Etienne as well could have made this list. Andre called it this past week in terms of the importance of Trevor Etienne in this game. Really dominant performance from him on the ground, especially because of the fact that Georgia was one of the lowest ranked SEC squads coming into that game running the football. So that just goes to show how important he could be. But ultimately, if you're a fantasy college football player, there's a lot of depth at each and every position. Not just talking about, big stars like him, or as Andre said, yes, sir, shout out to him, even though it pains me to shout out a player who destroyed my favorite college football team. But at the end of the day, if you're a fantasy college football player, it just goes to show how much depth there is. You have to look beyond, the Cam Wards, the Shedeur Sanders of the world, the Ashton Genties, the Travis Hunters, and maybe look towards the Bryson Dalys. There's a lot of depth at each and every position in college football, and I'm really excited to do this segment week in, week out, talking about these incredible athletes, because it truly is one of the most chaotic, exciting, heart-rending college football seasons we've seen in quite some time. And so just talking about it makes me get more and more excited for what the season has in store for us. But let me know what you think about my college football fantasy stars in the comments if you have your own as well. But right after this short break, we'll be returning to the world of the NFL, and we're going to be talking about my bold fantasy predictions this week. A lot to talk about there right after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast with our fourth segment of the day here. It should be a good one. And we come back to a comment though from Andre before we get into this segment. I never tried fantasy college football. I want to try next season though, and I completely agree. It is very niche. It is something that perhaps not a lot of people are familiar with, but I do want to bring it into the public eye a little bit more and talk about some of these guys because it's truly getting to be a very intriguing fantasy college football season. But I do want to get into our fourth segment of the day here, talk about some bold fantasy predictions, and I will say this. My first one that I have here in my graphic blew up in my face. As always, I always tell you guys this. I write these predictions before I even watch that week's games, so some of them might blow up in my face, and this one completely did. But there still is a chance. We just got word about an injury concerning this prediction from the head coach of the Washington Commanders, Dan Quinn. And so that might give you a hint as to what I want to talk about. Without further ado, let's get into it. I will face my embarrassment head on here. Caleb Williams outshining Jaden Daniels. Now, of course, Caleb can outshine Jaden Daniels if there is no Jaden Daniels in this game. But we just got word that Dan Quinn considers Jaden Daniels week to week with a rib injury, very much like what Quinn Ewers has gone through this season with the oblique. I feel like it could either mean he could start this week, or, he's going to have to sit out maybe 2-3 weeks to fully recover from this injury. However, one thing I will say about this prediction on both sides of the football is that Marcus Mariota is a serviceable backup. Yes, he only played the Panthers defense, and that doesn't tell us much, but I still feel like Marcus Mariota, from what I saw of him in a couple plays that we got from Red Zone for the Washington Commanders, whilst he can still operate this offense at a high level. And kudos to Cliff Kingsbury for preparing both of these guys for what his offense brings. And not for nothing, Marcus Mariota thrives in these kind of college-style offenses. So look for him to potentially have a say in this game as well. It's going to be a tough game, but here's the thing that I want to say about this prediction, regardless of whether or not Jaden Daniels plays. If Jaden Daniels doesn't play, that highly favors Caleb in this matchup, because not only is he not going to hear all the buzz about this being a potential match between the number 1 and number 2 pick in the draft, he's going to have much less pressure on him. And not for nothing, yes, he's been getting better, but this is a game that I feel like, Jaden Daniels would get more attention than him in this. And I don't know whether or not he would have handled it this well, especially coming off a high. As honestly, I would not be surprised if Caleb finishes a top 5 fantasy QB. His schedule the rest of the season is pure gold. And I completely agree. I feel like Caleb is someone who we've seen mature week in, week out. But this game really was a point of contention if Jaden Daniels were healthy for it. And he still could be, but I'm saying that if Jaden Daniels doesn't play, you don't necessarily have to worry about the pressure of it being a 1 versus 2 matchup in terms of your draft selection. So I do think that Caleb will shine, maybe scratch the Jaden Daniels part because we don't know his status, but I still think that Caleb will have a lot of value as the season goes on, especially if Jaden Daniels doesn't play in this game, because this could be a pressure point for him this season. And I think he'll live up to the expectations. The second one that I want to talk about is the Cowboys 49ers. It's going to be a bit of a snooze fest, I believe. It's a little premature. It's the Sunday night football game. And, we don't know whether or not, several of the 49ers' key players will be playing this game. Maybe Christian McCaffrey could return. We haven't necessarily heard any news about a timeline just yet for him. But the reason why I feel it's a snooze fest is because you have the Cowboys coming off, as I said, JD5 is considered week to week. We can confirm that. Just got the update as well, so thank you for that, my man. I do feel like the Cowboys coming off the bye, I don't even know. As Andre said, I didn't even see what happened. Did he take a bad hit? I actually didn't see what happened myself. All I know is that he only threw 2 passes in this game, and so I don't really know what really happened. But he did look a little bit himself on the sideline, so you never know. So we'll see. We'll see. It will make the matchup a little bit more exciting if he does play because of the storylines, but if he doesn't play, I still think it will be a good matchup between these two teams, the pretty much surprise teams of the NFC this season. But getting back into the Cowboys 49ers, this one between two teams who you thought would be premier teams in the NFC will be a snooze fest. Because the Cowboys, coming off the bye, I don't even really think it will help them that much. I still think, this defense, whether or not they are fully healthy or not, is atrocious, especially up front, stopping the run. And this offense, man, if you're a Cowboys fan and you continue to implore this offense to stop being so Dak and CD heavy, you can't help but think that it's not going to be pretty, even after a bye. But you never know. And I think this is a perfect game to truly test run something if you feel like your team is too Dak and CD centric. But on the other side of things, the 49ers are just super decimated. I don't necessarily know who will be the wide receiver 1 in this game. Will Ricky Pearsall, who might be making his first start after being almost fatally shot, be the wide receiver 1 in this game? Or will it be Jacob Cowing as well? So you never really know. I do think Debo might come back because it was just an illness he was going through this week. But the Ayuk injury looks pretty severe, and McCaffrey could still be out. So I don't really know what to think of this game from a fantasy perspective. That being said, both of these offenses have unique opportunities to prove themselves. For the 49ers to prove that they're not just overly reliant on their big stars of the Cowboys, to try something new outside of just trying to feed the CeeDee Lamb the football 40 to 50 times a game. So we'll see. The next one, the Raiders defense. This is a bold one. Top 5 against the Chiefs. Now, this one may not even be that bold, but I still think it's bold considering the fact that the Raiders defense may be what has to carry it the rest of the season. So it's going to depend on how much pressure they face and where they are on the field and things of that nature. But I still think that the Chiefs' offense is one in which I don't necessarily really trust Travis Kelce to carry the brunt of the load. If, there's really no offensive weapon outside of him that steps up. I don't know whether or not Mecole Hardman or Sky Moore, for no matter how long they've been there for, can be the answer. But I do think that the Raiders' defense definitely feels like they'll have a slight advantage in terms of those two units going up against each other. Just because of the fact that, like Patrick Mahomes addressed himself, he's not playing his best football, and we still don't know what this Chiefs offense can be. They do seem to have a decent run game with Kareem Hunt and Isaiah Pacheco and Carson Steele, but that might be all they have for a little bit of time until they figure out, how do we move the football passing it. So look for the Raiders defense to try to exploit that aspect of the Chiefs offense. But it still is a bold prediction in that the Raiders defense might be on the field for very long periods of time for the rest of their games this season. And the last one I want to talk about, speaking of top 5 fantasy QBs, and speaking about the disrespect this particular one has gotten throughout the season, Geno Smith, surprising top 10 performer. And I'm imploring you, if you're watching and Geno Smith is on waivers, pick him up. No matter who you have at QB, pick him up. He is someone who cannot be ignored any longer. He is someone who, in real life, can be viewed as a top 10 quarterback. And I feel like this game against the Bills is going to be an underrated matchup to watch for both teams, because Seattle, you feel like they're going to really struggle trying to contain Josh Allen. But I do feel like if you contain Josh Allen, that's half the battle, because you contain most of the Bills' offense if you can contain him. On the Seattle side of things, I do feel that the Bills' defense is a little bit sketchy, as Andre said Ayuk is officially out for the season. So that's how the cookie crumbles there in San Fran. As the downfall of the Niners is here, Chris. To be honest with you, I feel like the Seahawks have a unique opportunity. This is perhaps their toughest stretch of their schedule thus far. And not for nothing, that game against the Falcons proved that, yes, it may be the weakest of the three quarterbacks in this three-game stretch for Seattle that they are facing, but it does prove that they can beat elite offenses. And so they'll definitely be in the NFC West race. I still think highly of the Niners because no matter what, they still find ways to incorporate different guys. But it is an opportunity, to see if Seattle can have staying power in this division for the first season of the Mike Macdonald era. And Geno Smith's going to have to be a big part of that. And not for nothing, I do feel like we saw at least signs of life for this Seattle running game with Kenneth Walker this week, but I still think it's going to be heavily reliant on Geno Smith's quick throws, finding soft spots in coverage, and ultimately him trying to remain as efficient as possible. So I think that it's silly and ludicrous that he's still out there on waiver wires, and this is completely unbiased opinion. Maybe not that much so, because I do love the Seattle Seahawks. But that being said, no matter what, I trust Geno Smith will continue to be a solid performer this season in both real life and fantasy. But let me know what you think about this in the comments, because these predictions could be true, they could be not. I already missed on one with my Caleb outshining Jaden Daniels, because Jaden Daniels might not even play, and I'm still going to be irked by it as the week goes on. But to close out the show, speaking of quarterbacks, we're going to be starting my positional rankings for this week with the quarterback position. It's going to be a good one to end off today's show. I'll be right back. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our final segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And it is the first of our 5 positional rankings throughout the week, starting off with the quarterback position. The 4 quarterbacks I've compiled are an interesting amalgamation of QBs, to say the least. I always try and vary it up. These aren't the guys you see in the fantasy rankings week in, week out consistently top them. These are guys who I personally feel either have something to prove, have good matchups, or just have an interesting feeling about in these games. You can take this any way you want. You can immediately eschew it from your mind after the show, but these are my personal fantasy rankings, but I do want to hear your opinions on them if you have any throughout this segment. So without further ado, let's jump into our final segment of the day with my personal fantasy QB rankings. Starting off, let's talk about Kyler Murray a little bit. Obviously, hasn't played this week. He will play tonight against the Chargers. But I do feel like Kyler Murray, to most people, has been very disappointing this season from a fantasy perspective, because we really don't know how to gauge him when the offense has run so hot and cold. But looking at this matchup against the Dolphins, who may have a little glimmer of optimism if it looks like Tua will start. He will practice on Wednesday. But on the other side of the football, Kyler Murray is still someone, as I know, said, I need to trade Mason ASAP. I know Shanahan is panicking, going to rush CMC back now. I'm not sure. I feel like Kyle Shanahan, here's the thing here, we want to see at least one game from these guys like Pearsall, like Cowing, and maybe even Mason. But I do feel like you're not wrong in thinking that this could be panic mode for the 49ers. I do feel like this match with the Cowboys could potentially be a trap game. I don't think so, just because of how bad the Cowboys have looked. But I do feel like this could be an interesting game to see how Shanahan views those either secondary or third string guys in this one. Maybe he makes Mason stick around for a game or two. I wouldn't necessarily sell Mason as high as some other players around the league in terms of how trades affect them, so to speak. But I do feel like Mason is someone who may still have one or two good games left in him. But going back to Kyler Murray here, I do feel like this matchup is an interesting one. I do like the Dolphins' defense, if that's something that might be worrying here for this matchup. But at the end of the day, you have to feel like Kyler Murray will have at least a couple games where we see glimpses of what he was doing early in his career. So look for Kyler Murray, maybe potentially tonight, to not have the best game, but he's going to come back with a vengeance. He just feels like someone who's going to amp it up as the season goes on, as he gains more familiarity in this offense. But I do have faith that he will have some good fantasy starts starting off next week in Week 8. And the next guy I want to talk about, we talked about him a little bit, Caleb Williams. Fresh off a bye, fresh back from London, so having time to reacclimatize himself to the American lifestyle. Don't really know how to put it. But going up against the Commanders, now the pressure's taken off his shoulders, as Anderson expecting a Josh Allen legacy game against the Seahawks. Well, here's the thing. I do feel like Josh Allen will have to be the reason why the Bills win this game, just because I think that they've placed a lot of stock in trading for Amari Cooper, in how they can vary. As Anderson said, Seattle is just one of my favorite prop teams to bet against. So I do feel like Josh Allen can have a good game, but it's going to be dependent on, him being as efficient as possible. If he's efficient, then I think that this could potentially be, and I'm not even joking, a blowout. I feel that, Amari Cooper just adds a second dimension to this offense they didn't have before. But, if Seattle can try and keep him in the pocket for when he does throw the football, then maybe, they take away the biggest weapon the Bills have and make it one-dimensional. And even though the Seattle run defense has not been good, James Cook, much to my chagrin, because he's on my fantasy team, has not looked good these past couple of weeks. And Ray Davis has not proved that he was a hidden gem on the waiver wire. So, who knows? But at the end of the day, Josh Allen will always be someone who is a point of contention in betting, in fantasy, in real life. But going back to the Caleb point, I do feel like if, word comes out that Jaden Daniels will not play in this game, then Caleb a weight will be lifted off his shoulders here. Because just hearing the storylines, hearing all the praise and plaudits Jaden Daniels has gotten leading up to this game, maybe would not have been the best thing. But coming off the bye, who knows? As Andre also asked a question about trying to sell Mason. He's trying to sell him before CMC comes back. Would I be crazy to trade him for B-Rob, Pollard, or Swift? Those kind of running backs? Not far-fetched. I mean, not for nothing. I love what Swift has done the past couple of weeks. It looked like a fantasy bust, to be honest with you, for the first 3 weeks of the season, and then turned into perhaps one of the best running backs in the entire league, at least from a fantasy perspective, over the last several weeks. So, Swift could be a good option. Pollard's an underrated option. Don't know how the Titans' offense is going to look, whether or not Mason Rudolph or Will Levis is the starter. And B-Rob, the thing about him is I love him, especially as a fantasy player, but it's a very crowded running back room in Washington with him, Eckler, and McNichols. So I do like Swift out of all those options if you do want to trade Mason. But I do feel like maybe Shanahan wants to see what he has with these guys. Because look, guys like CMC, Kittle, maybe even Purdy, a couple of years down the road, might not even be there. So he's going to want to look at all the options he drafted, these cheaper options, to really assess what he has going forward. Because the 49ers could come crumbling down real quick, with all the contract situations they have to deal with. And so I do feel like that could be something, if the season goes off the rails for the Niners, that Shanahan wants to look into going forward. But it certainly is an interesting question here. But out of all those running backs that you mentioned, Swift is the guy. I personally love having him now on my fantasy team, whereas before I was dreading each and every single week for him. So he's a nice addition if you do look to add him. Good luck to you in that trade. But the third quarterback I want to talk about here is a guy who you might be a little bit skeptical. Obviously, not looked his best. Looked very rusty, in fact, this season, but potentially had his most efficient game. As Andre said, apparently CMC is eyeing a Week 10 return after the Week 9 bye week. Perfect timing. So yeah, you get 2 more, maybe potentially solid, good games out of Mason, as Andre also thanks me as well. Thank you, my man, for the comments. I do feel like that's the perfect timing, because you see Mason, you potentially either drop him before or you try and trade him when people still think he might have value. But who knows? It's definitely an interesting situation there in San Fran. But Trevor Lawrence was someone who I want to talk about here, and he might be a surprising name to hear in these rankings. But what I've seen from Trevor in that one game abroad is that when he has structure and stability in his offense, he starts to trust the game more. I actually think, even though he wasn't a big contributor, having a guy like Evan Engram there really helps the diversity of the Jags offense, because he is their best route runner, but he also opens up a lot of space for the Jaguars to operate on offense, and opened up Brian Thomas Jr. to have a game enough to warrant me putting him as my wide receiver fantasy star of the week. So, if Trevor Lawrence's best traits are revealed, then he could be someone who could be serviceable in fantasy. Yes, it's a tough Packers defense he's going up against this week, but coming back, have him acclimatize again to his body clock and things of that nature, because he did spend 2 weeks in London, and that could be a little bit of a problem here. But I do think that Evan Engram could change the game for him, could relax him, just knowing that he has someone who could open up a lot of what he likes best. And maybe it's to his detriment, but maybe it's to his benefit as well. That's the beauty of fantasy football. We never really know. And the last guy also kind of is a little bit of surprise on my list, Aaron Rodgers. And to say his performance last night was bizarre is a little bit of an understatement here. It was a really weird offensive performance overall of the Jets. There were a couple good things about it, like Breece Hall being more involved. And there were a couple of those Aaron Rodgers, Devontae Adams connections. but overall it was less than the sum of its parts. But he's going up against a Patriots team that, really is on the ropes on the defensive side of the football, at the very least. And so I feel like give this Jets offense a little bit of time to find its footing, and potentially they can win games like this. I don't know if they're at the level where they can win games against tougher teams, even to try and stay in this AFC East race, but they can at the very least win games like this against the Patriots, and they have a lot of easy games in their schedule. So if there's any sort of optimism there, it's you have perhaps the easiest schedule of any NFL team left, and you have now perhaps one of the best QB wide receiver duos of the past couple of years at your disposal, and you have good secondary options around you to supplement that connection. So that's why I feel like Aaron Rodgers in a couple of these games could be an interesting fantasy asset, even though, a lot of people think that song is ended. But I still think he has a couple good games left in him. But that concludes my, as always, another great show. Have a good rest of your day. Bro, peace. That's Andre. Thank you to you, my man. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been, as always, Christopher Shepard. Thank you to you all for watching. But if you want more content such as this, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show on the network. A great way to support me and my fellow podcasters who are all great in their own rights. But also, if you want to interact like Andre has done, Day One fan, perfect example of this, making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Fit Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way, as always, to contribute and interact with the show. But other than that, thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back, as always, same time, 3:30 p.m. Eastern, for another great edition of the show. I'm out.